so automatically the mics are turned off. We'll be taking audience questions throughout the event. So please put your questions in the Q&A functions as they arise. I saw several of you have already done so. Thank you. Note that we have, as of right now, 470 people in the Zoom. We had about 1,000 people RSVP, so it's quite possible more will show up. So we will inevitably not get to all of your questions, or we may need to combine questions that come up several times. So thank you for bearing with us. Final technical note, I am informed that my internet is not amazing currently. So if I at any that might look a little awkward. I'm sorry about that, but just I want to soften the blow when it actually, if this should actually come to pass. But for now, let me introduce our guests. Jules Gill Peterson is an associate professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh and the author of Histories of the Transgender Child. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Welcome. And Marcus Bay is an assistant professor of African American Studies at Northwestern and the author of Them Goon Rules, Fugitive Essays on Radical Black Feminism. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you, thank you.
Is an associate professor at the University of California at Berkeley and is the author of Quaint, Exquisite, Victorian Aesthetics and the Idea of Japan. Hi. Good to be here. Excellent. Well, thank you so much all for being here, and thank you for talking with us about this this topic. When we advertised this event online, the response was pretty explosive, to be honest. And I should emphasize again that we picked the title, not any of our panelists. So we're not going to ask any of you to justify it. But can you explain to our audience what sort of a figure as a trans person in the world?
Adrian, could you maybe just repeat the question one more time? Because we missed just a tiny part of it. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Well, my question was, what kind of a figure is a TERF, and where do you encounter them as a trans person, either online or IRL?
I'm happy to take it off the bat. Yeah, the TERF as a figure, I think, is a really interesting place to start, insofar as I think that phrase carries a lot of different meaning and different forms of encounter. I've been writing lately about the TERF that lives inside my head, which is a sort of figuration that speaks to the life that transphobia has, bodily life that transphobia has in reducing trans people's life chances overall and our well-being and our equity. But certainly it seems like TERFs have risen as political figures, right, as these sort of unlikely bedfellows, as these sort of referenced as part of a kind of transnational network of political actors across the spectrum, right and left, and often mobilize their own kinds of figures to do their work. So, one of the ones I've been the most interested in is the figure of the mom, the not coincidentally often white mom who's terrified of their child becoming suddenly, with no explanation, trans, as if that were a thing. But yeah, I think there are a sort of wide array of figurations that travel under TERF. There are historical ones, like in the 70s. So I think as trans folks, we encounter those all the time, kind of every single day, if you want to count the one buried into your brain. And so, ironically, I'd say at a time during this pandemic, when for myself, as like a brown trans woman, I've been kind of happy to be holed up at home. It's been a measurable harm reduction in my life. I actually feel as though I'm nevertheless encountering TERFs more than ever. And some of that might have to do with the way that the internet feels like the only public sphere at the moment, at least for those of us lucky enough to be sequestered at home with internet access. But yeah, I think there's a sort of proliferation going on right now around this figure.
I can take it up next if that's
Thank
cool.
you. Yeah, please.
So when I think about this question, I initially wanted to say that the TERF is this kind of nuisance, a kind of perverse gadfly, annoying the public with their trans antagonism. But I fear that for me to say this would be to kind of evacuate TERFs of their impact and their influence. And this is not to say that TERFs are the end all and be all of problems and opponents that trans folks have to deal with, which I deeply disagree with. That there are a whole host of other vectors of society and societal actors who prove much more combative and harmful for trans people, namely the medical industrial complex, to use the language of this talk, the police and law enforcement, and even more like abstracted notions such as the pervasiveness and the deep structuring logic of the gender binary. But still, for me, the Terf as a figure seems important because the Terf serves, in my estimation, as this affirmation of the, or to the larger public, of the purported like golden years of feminist activism, which contrasts with the supposed too farness of contemporary radical trans insurrectionary thinking and activism. So it seems to me that TERFs serve to undermine contemporary radical trans feminist work with their kind of second wave platitudes by making recourse to worn notions of biological determinism and moral imperatives that are actually thinly veiled recapitulations of misogyny and the deprivation of privacy too, in self-determination, while also granting larger society the ability to kind of take on a titular feminism and the presumed progressiveness that it entails by way of an agreement with a certain feminine position or feminist position that has been historically marginalized. It's a strange kind of deployment of a type of feminism as such, couched in notions of reality or naturalness, which in the end align deeply with cis male supremacy. For me, the figure of the Terf, I guess, in short, gains whatever validity it is said to have by conforming to patriarchy and cis normativity while possessing kind of a less hostile name, to put it simply.
Well, I thought that I would sound sensible by going third, but actually, what I have to say is far less striking and persuasive, I think, either than Jules's account of the Terf as a kind of figurative psychic reality for queer and trans people, and then also Marquis's understanding of the Terf as a gadfly who serves this kind of nostalgic role. I think that's exactly right. I hadn't quite put it together, but one of the questions that people often ask about the Terf industrial complex is why does it seem located in Britain? As a British person, that's sometimes tricky for me to answer. And I think Marquis.
The question already was in the Q&A, so I think it's good that you're bringing it up. Yeah.
Well, no, I think Marquis has already given a better answer than I can really, which is to say that it's bound up with some notion of a pre-post-structuralist feminist nostalgia when everything made sense. When it wasn't like 1984 because it wasn't yet 1984. But here's my theory of the Terf industrial complex, because I've been thinking a lot in preparation for this event. Why is this group so powerful, and yet how does it understand itself as so powerless? To people like me, who spend every day out in the world being transgender, being spat at, being confronted physically whenever I go to a public bathroom, whether it's the men's or the women's bathroom. It seems undeniable that this is a powerful ideology, but I'm also very sensitive to the way that, at the center, there's a group of people who really believe themselves to be powerless and really believe themselves to be left behind. And I've been really trying to understand that, and I've come up with what I think of as a sort of three-part understanding of the Terf industrial complex. In the middle of which is a group called the Gender Critical Feminists, which is a more or less marginal group of feminist thinkers and activists who are very much of the kind that Marquis is describing, very much of a kind of nostalgic, second wavy form of feminist organizing and feminist ideology, of a kind that was usually left behind by the 1982 Barnard Conference and the emergence of lesbian and gay civil rights movements in the 80s and 90s, but which I think endures, and whose endurance can be seen in the work of writers and thinkers like Holly Lawton and Jane Clare Jones. And then on the other hand, in one direction you have this other group which is quite different, and I've called that the anti-woke trolls. And in that group you have a person like Graham Linehan, who is a sort of former sitcom writer who seems to have in recent years become kind of deranged around trans issues. And I try to be very careful of the ableist language I use when describing Graham Linehan especially, and I apologize for deranged. It's difficult sometimes to describe the extremely intense degree of animus that is thrown at us, but an alt-right troll like Linehan, or the anti-woke left in a figure like Andrew Doyle, who has links to, is a prominent British anti-trans activist, who has links to the alt-right by being close to Ann Coulter. And then this kind of odd anti-woke left movement that's born around the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is not a communist party, in fact, but a sort of odd cult of personality founded by Bob Avakian, which is remarkably influential online, and also, for what it's worth, remarkably influential in my hometown of Berkeley, where there's a revolutionary bookstore, which all of my colleagues think it's cool to go and speak at, despite the fact that they are not in solidarity with any left party, and no left party organizes with their outcomes. So there's that, right? There's this kind of totally unacceptable trolling alt-right swamp that the gender criticals have made a pact with. And that pact, I think, is fracturing. And that's why I think this event today is so important and happens at such a timely moment. Because the fracturing of that alliance between the alt-right and the gender critical feminists can be seen in a few different ways. It can be seen by the fact that Graham Linehan has been kicked off Twitter as a result of things he said about me, for what it's worth. It can be seen in the fact that Kathleen Stock, one of the major gender critical feminist thinkers, has disavowed a large part of the anti-trans movement online because of its obsession with calling trans women pedophiles and making fun of their appearance. And then it can be seen by the closure of the gender critical subreddit. And in general, I think, you know, when we agreed to do this event, I thought that, you know, nothing was going to change. But I have this sense now that we're at a moment where that relationship between the Graham Linehans of the world and the Kathleen Stocks of the world can no longer quite hold. The third part of the trans-industrial complex, though, is really still in place. And that's what I've called the liberal institutionalists. And the liberal institutionalists are people who probably don't have very much in common with the gender critical feminists in their view of the world, but who have some sense that their free speech is being threatened. And because they have that sense and a desire to protect the liberal organs of state represented especially by the university, the political party, you know, I think those two especially, but others too, they are willing to go along with the gender critical feminists, not realizing that they're also getting into bed with the alt-right trolls. So in terms of thinking like, what is a TERF in 2020? A TERF for me is a political money launderer. The TERF is the person that makes alt-right troll techniques and politics acceptable to liberals who under no other circumstances would acknowledge their relationship with or their debt to people like Milo Yiannopoulos. But because it's coming from this apparently embattled group of white feminists, that relationship is allowed to be sustained and with a bit of luck, perhaps not for much longer.
Well, fascinating, and I think that gets to a really important question here too, which is on the one hand, as you say, that when we chose the word industrial complex for this title, we were being a little tongue-in-cheek, because of course, as things that take place online, things that place on, you know, in subreddits, you know, and a lot of the people we're talking about would probably claim that they don't have a whole lot of power. But I would be interested in drilling down. Does the power then that this figure has, this discursive formation has, does it come from this money laundering system that you're talking about, from the fact that it can sort of translate things from one segment of society to the other, or does it come from something else?
Yeah, I think that there's a way maybe to get at that by thinking more about how race figures into all of this.
Yeah.
Doesn't figure, but materializes institutions and stratifies who gets to live under what circumstances and who's left to die in our societies. because that to me seems like part of the question of how a figure would have any sort of material purchase. And the pandemic has obliterated my memory, so I won't remember who tweeted this, but I saw someone tweet, in the last week, something to the effect of like, well, fighting TERFs has kind of always felt to me a little bit like a white trans issue. And I was thinking a lot about that because, I was trying to think about what that tweet was attempting to communicate, right? And I think that there's a sort of broader question about what systemic forms of the regulation of human life disproportionately impact trans people, right? And I was thinking about how, I did feel this sort of new form of siloing on social media where I had like this sort of trans clout, like bot producing folks, largely on Twitter, like really trying to engage in some of these battles over the constitution of trans people's existence as a matter of free speech. And then like for me, it's like literally that's Twitter, and then my Instagram is all Black trans and trans people of color circulating mutual aid projects, GoFundMe's, getting people out of jail, and getting people housing, and starting, and like I was thinking, like, I guess I've never seen the word TERF there. And part of the answer is, of course, that Black trans women and brown trans women don't even register under the imaginary that TERFs operate on. They're not even like worthy enough to be harassed in that way because they're so devalued. But there's something else that I think is interesting to think about here, right? Which is sort of like, what are the conditions, and this is the industrial complex part for me, that wear people out, right? And so yeah, the medical industrial complex and the prison industrial complex and policing, right, feel like part and parcel, but not in a literal sense, right? The affiliation is not so obviously detectable, but it does sort of seem like, on the one hand, there's a sort of rhetorical battle over who is the most humiliated, aggrieved white subject, right? And it's no surprise in my mind that white women step up, right, to lead this political movement. It is, at least since the 19th century, the direct province of white women's feminism to pursue white supremacy. That is like the primary project of American and it seems also English white feminism in its dominant narrative mode, right, is to pursue the cause of civilization, so-called, and to think about the regulation and reproduction of the race as white women's sort of duty. And so, of course, those are the same women who now can be terrified at the idea that white children assigned female at birth might turn out not to grow up to be women. But there's a horizontal line to draw, I think, right, to the problem of hypervisibility and the extreme violence and structural neglect that faces most trans people who are poor and who are of color and who don't have time to be targeted online, and who are living under different conditions than the ones that TERFs imagine as reality. But I do think that would be the connection. Like, if there's a sort of industrial complex model here, it would be one that in my most academic mode I would just call biopolitics, right?
Yeah.
It's not a mistake when white women choose their gender choose their whiteness over their gender, right? It's actually the purpose of white femininity and white gender to prosecute and manipulate and utilize non-white people's bodies and non-normative bodies as resources for their enrichment. And so the sort of, one of the things that I think is really sort of eerie, right, is that, like, in the case of TERFs focused on children, which is the thing that I have done the most research on, it's extremely painful in our organizing and our activism in response to that the most effective rhetorical campaign we have is that these policies, right, whether it's some state law banning healthcare for kids or everything that has happened in the UK to make it basically impossible for minors to access transition, like that will lead to their deaths, right? And the specter is always suicide. And the answer to that is, of course, yes, but there's no shaming people for that. Not because TERFs are shameless. That's something we could say, but because there's no shame in modern nation states in letting massive populations of people die, that's the way that we produce value and extract value out of gender, and out of race and out of reproductivity. So I think that the sort of industrial complex thing is so deeply enfolded into our own living tissues, whether we go to the doctor or we get pulled over by the cops or we get incarcerated or we lose our job, or we get harassed online. And there is a way in which this isn't a sort of totalizing kind of reductionist narrative, but about a system, an interlocking system that actually does what gender is supposed to do, which is make us vulnerable to state power and people acting on behalf of state power, whether or not they understand themselves to be ideologically they are. You know, having a gender, unfortunately, obligates us inside of a system that is primarily harmful.
Well, that was wonderful. So I'm only going to add a little bit to that. So yeah, so if the question is like what kind of or what are the ways that Terfs employ power or what kind of power is that? For me, I think the power Terfs have or deploy or subject themselves to comes from their, as I noted before, their ability to maneuver through normative ways of thinking, which then gives them a little bit of clout and power by virtue of their proximity to things that are sanctioned by cis male supremacy, but while operating under the guise of a loose, ostensibly progressive feminism. And I think this translates into a power to stall trans feminist insurrection. And that doesn't simply mean, to me at least, that laws preventing trans people from using bathrooms are instituted or laws providing trans people with access to gender affirmative surgeries are taken off the table. It's kind of more than that, even if these things are quite important for trans livability in the here and now. But ultimately Terfs seem to have the power to renaturalize and reinstill or to further solidify the stranglehold of the gender binary, which is in and of itself a mode of violence and violation. Terfs then have some power to proliferate violence on a broad scale, proliferate and verify and validate violence on a broad scale. And the things that they advocate for have the power to create and recreate a society that is structured by the violation of non-normative genders. So that is the kind of violence that concerns me. It's less the spectacularized or sensational forms of violence, which to be sure are very important to combat, but that's less my claim. My claim is that there's a conditioning force, a kind of background noise and ground that enables those instances of violence and to even be fathomable. And that background is what I often set my sights on. And that I think is the power that Terfs have. They kind of dip into that background noise to cultivate the very ground on which to make their claims. And that then proliferates to do violation and harm to people with non-normative genders.
You know, I'm so moved by reminders from both Marquis and Jules that, in a sense, the whole sideshow of the spectacular forms of cruelty that are exhibited on a daily basis by the Terf industrial complex, that in a sense that is a sideshow, and that the real work that is happening under the sign of an industrial complex is the reproduction of patriarchy, is the reproduction of a medical industrial complex, a prison industrial complex that goes to making life impossible and expendable, especially for trans people of color. I'm moved by that, especially because I am someone who historically has made the mistake of getting too involved in Twitter bullshit, and I am moved by my colleagues and my comrades' reminder that there is better and other work to do. And you know, the truth of the matter is that you know, I think about the questions that are interesting to Terfs about, you know, the difference between biological sex and gender, and I sort of think like, well, it's the kind of philosophical or technical question. This doesn't have any impact on my life. I surround myself with people who see me in a way that makes sense to me, that doesn't feel wholly alienating. We recognize there are complexities. but it's not as though any of this is absolutely abominable to think of. And that makes me think, and I'm moving in a different direction, but to be clear, I think what I'm saying is less important than what Jules and Marcus were saying. One of the things that I think characterizes the Terf rhetorical gesture is to attempt to replace political questions, political contradictions with metaphysical contradictions, to attempt to remove or erase questions like how do we decarcerate, how do we abolish the police state, how do we provide adequate healthcare, how do we decriminalize sex work, and then much more interested in questions like, well, you know, what if someone had an XXY chromosome, but they have, and it's like, you know, I could care less. The constant attempt to relitigate trans women or women instead of answering questions about decarceration, abolition, sex work, medical access to medical care, access to healthcare. You know, I refuse to litigate those things now. I don't care whether you think trans women are women, as long as you think trans women are people who are deserving of the same basic civil rights as other people, rights that the gender critical movement, with the aid of the alt-right, has been undermining and eroding for some years now. So, you know, that's one of the places where I find myself having occasional friendly and sometimes spirited disagreements with other trans people. You know, for me, the important stuff is the boots on the ground political questions about how do we organize around issues like abolition? How do we organize around issues like decarceration, prison abolition? I am not interested in you telling me you have a strange casuistical construction about a prisoner who decides that they're trans halfway through. It's also fictional. They're interested in these fictional, hypothetical, ethical questions, and I could not care less. My position on prisons is that we abolish them. My position on sex work is that we decriminalize it. And that's what a politics is. A politics doesn't need to litigate the chromosome.
One question. So I hope that I'm seeing in the Q&A that apparently my video feed is not great. I hope I can get to these two questions because they're from great. I would love to everyone's opinions on them. So one question that connects directly to what all three of you were saying is, you know, so if one were to taxonomize and talk about to what extent the position that you've imputed to the Terf is different from just sort of the kind of baseline transphobia that you might encounter somewhere, and on the other hand, where you might see and vis-a-vis where you might see their feminism. And then the second question is, I think what you were just saying, Grace, is the engagement with gender critical feminism or with that element of the sort of industrial complex is engagement with that maybe a distraction from these kinds of concerns about the everyday lives of trans people that you were bringing up. And I think that I've seen 2 or 3 questions in the Q&A now to that point. I think it'd be good for us all to think about them. Why is it worth paying attention to this? Or is it worth? I don't know.
I can take
I think Marcus, yeah.
I'll take a shot at the first one, but I'll sneak in an answer to the second one, because I think that it's, I mean, I do think, I was literally talking about this in my undergrad class earlier today, so apologies if I sound professorial right now, but it's a problem with the word trans. Like, you know, I'm not sure we know what the word transphobia means. I mean, the phobia words have been, you know, not super useful rhetorically because their literal meaning is so silly, right? Like, you're afraid, right? That being said, there could be a sort of phenomenology of disgust, you know, through which we think about how violence is enacted. I mean, I don't, you know, I'm sure people are afraid of me, and that maybe gives me some delight to imagine. But the word trans, right, itself isn't necessarily fully encompassing, and so the trans and transphobia, I think, actually is maybe more of the problem than the trans and then the phobia, right? And so trans is also in TERF. And I think part of the challenge here is that there is a historical specificity to trans misogyny, and it over determines in that very like classical sense, trans as a word, right? And that's why, I mean, I'm very curious about, like, sure, lots of people pivotally respond, and often transmasculine folks or trans men respond like, I don't even think TERFs know that I exist, right? That there could be a trans man, or when they say transgender man, they're using that as a slur against trans women, right? Um, but and yeah, right, I'm actually really surprised and interested, and I have this kind of burning suspicion that the gender critical moms, for example, are not actually like the real human beings they're worried about are trans masculine people. Probably lots of them are non-binary, and that's very odd, because the history of transphobia is very overdetermined by trans misogyny. But I think, and here's the link for me to the everyday thing. So I think there is a value here to making clear when something is a product of trans misogyny. Because there's a certain impossibility and disposability that's so overwrought, right? And it has to do with the feminist question of how do women get enlisted, right, to act against their own interests as a class, right? Why is it white women's job to police the category woman, right? Why is it intellectual feminism's job to police the category of woman? And I think that has to do with the fact that like that trans women, you know, if I could be a little dramatic about it, just like don't really exist in the world. We are figurations much more than the TERFs are. And I think one of the biggest challenges I found as someone who, you know, wrote a book and then later started taking estrogen was like I could track in real time what happened to my ability to speak in public. So I appreciate that I'm allowed to do that right now. But there's a way in which, like, for me, you know, coming into trans womanhood was about coming to realize that I didn't really have a very useful speaking position, because trans women's language is rendered in two modes only: either total disrespect, you don't exist, you're not even real, or you're perfect, you're a goddess, everything you say is oracular and truthful. And yes, many trans women are goddesses and oracular and have truths to say. But part of what I'm getting at is I think like the non-reality imagined to trans womanhood, right, is a different form than the non-reality imagined by the TERF who doesn't know trans men exist, right? If the charge is not that they cannot, philosophically cannot exist, right? The charge is something more perverse. In the case of trans misogyny, it's that I can see your chromosomes, which you've never seen, and I know what they are, and I know what that makes you, right? Or what that doesn't make you. And so I think one thing that would be really interesting for me to imagine what it would be like to break some of the TERF industrial complex and to also break through its trans misogynist version and not just its sort of generally transphobic version, would be to think about how that unleashes trans women's everyday lives as immensely productive, right? Like this is another version of, like Grace, I think you put it so well, right? A lot of anti-transness is metaphysics, right? It's very abstracted on purpose, and it's a discussion on being, who is allowed to be and who isn't. And the stakes can be as high as life and death. It's true. It's not always a metaphor, but like the rest of my life is lived in between the poles of life and death, right? I am not 100% alive right now, and I'm also not 100% dead. And so the meaningfulness of what I have to say as a trans woman of color, right, is largely eclipsed by the context of trans misogyny, in the sense that like my own words often feel meaningless to me. And I think that has something to do with the way in which like the political distraction, the sideshow quality, also is a theft of subjectivity. It's the theft of your interiority. It's the theft of opacity, the right to be left alone, the right to be inscrutable, and the right to be unknown, right? And I think that that's something that to me brushes up alongside and may not be the same thing as our politics, right? And I'm glad that our trans politics that are intersectional, that are abolitionist, you know, that are Black and brown led, are central right now. I think that we also are entitled to and deserve much more than just political discourse, right? We deserve metaphysics. We deserve, I mean, because ours will be a lot more fun. We deserve gossipy things. We deserve all the things that we're actually doing, that we do off screen, outside of the public eye, but have no status as of yet, because they have to be routed back into a state of emergency, right? And then, the thing about the state of emergency is that it is structurally violent, but you keep on living during it until you don't. And so there's something about that I think TERFs have been very successful in suppressing, which is to say the immense power. Like, as a historian, this is the last thing that I'll say on this, like, I try to think a lot about street queens and trans women of color, sex workers, the folks who get lionized as figures, right? Say in the 60s leading up to Stonewall, the people that we are asked, finally, amazingly, right, to respect and to call on. And I think about like the amount of sheer knowledge, both as a repertoire, as content, and like savoir-faire, like technical knowledge that it took for trans women of color to live safely, do sex work, steal hormones, administer them to one another and transition and stay alive as best they could, resist police violence, get each other out of jail, found political movements that would ripple for the rest of the century. These are some of the most brilliant, talented, smartest people to have ever walked the earth, right? And yet they exist largely as figures. And the question that is interesting about them can never possibly be, were they really women? Like, it's so absurd, right? They were galaxy brain, a long time before that meme, right? They were on a whole other level. So I think we haven't even tapped, right, the resources of transness, because trans women, especially poor trans women of color, have been at the forefront and are really like basically the undergirding of the entire queer world, and never get half, not even 1% of the credit that they should for it, in part because everything has turned into an adversarial litigation over some abstract idea about what is and what isn't gender. Anyways, that's my answer to both questions.
I'm going to have to jump in because, Jules is just so brilliant, and I love that we deserve metaphysics. On the list of things that trans women deserve, I think metaphysics is important. We need to be able to think about meaning, about the nature of things, about the nature of identity, the nature of desire, the nature of love, the nature of embodiment. These things are the things that we teach as English professors. They're the things that we think about as intellectuals. They're the things that we want our students to think about as teachers. And, again, the idea that we have to begin those conversations with, I checked my chromosomes and my chromosomes tell me this much, and then having deduced what my chromosomes were, I decided to go to that. I mean, it's like, yeah, I'm not.
Can we just very quickly ask? Several people in the Q&A asked about metaphysics and the.
I want to hear those questions so badly.
Say that there's. Sorry, did I break up for a second there? Shoot. Just the question of metaphysics came up in the Q&A a couple of times. Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, what exactly is the problem there, or is the promise there too?
Well, I mean, that came up for me, so I can answer that. But it needn't be a problem, right? I think that the rhetorical technique that I'm describing is a tendency to displace a question of political organization onto one of meaning. That is to say, to take a question like, how do we provide adequate healthcare for gender non-conforming children, to be an ontological question about the nature of sexuality, the nature of sex embodiment, the question of whether or not gender is a term with any real meaning. I've got to tell you, as a sort of slight anecdote, I recently have noticed this trend in the Terf world of people stopping referring to gendered language, and starting referring to sexed language or sexed pronouns. Adrian, you and I both have degrees in comparative literature, so we can quite easily talk about the difference between sex and gender in linguistic terms. But I think it's indicative of the sort of profound and bizarre philistinism of the anti-trans movement, that they seem now inclined to think that even language has a sex that is natural and preeminent over its gender. But in any case, that, for example, is a metaphysical question. What does it mean to refer to a language as gendered? That's a question that is meaningful. It is an interesting one. As someone who speaks multiple languages and thinks a lot about language, I'm super interested in that question. it does not exist on the same terrain or on the same ground as the question of how should a doctor prescribe medical treatment for a kid who's looking for an intervention on the basis of gender dysphoria. Those two questions are just like, they're not the same kind of question. And until we can learn to distinguish between them, we're going to get stuck in the circle of litigating trans women and women over and over again, which to me, as I say, is sort of the least interesting part of all of this. And also, for what it's worth, I think, and this is echoing stuff that Jules said a while ago, I think the question of whether or not trans women are women is preeminently a question of concern for white trans women. Like that is not a question the radical black trans women that Jules was talking about are invested in. I have had this on my table all day, which is to say, I was earlier reading the documents that Jules was talking about, the testimony of Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson in the aftermath of the Stonewall riots. And it's very clear they don't have a single consistent metaphysical position on whether they are women. Neither the Terfs nor the trans women or women partisans are going to be able to take a single moral out of that. The meanings that they're creating are local and situational, and to use Marcus's word, fugitive. They are practices of freedom being experimented with and created for political purposes in an immediate short term. That's what we need. We don't need to establish more and more casuistical reasoning about what to do if someone wanted to win Wimbledon by pretending to be a woman. It's an insult to our collective intellect.
So I have very little to add to all of this. This was phenomenal. So Grace and Jules, bravo for all the wonderfulness that you all shared. I think one of the things I'm going to latch on to, I'm just going to sidestep all the topics that you two have already talked about because I would not be able to say them much better at all. But one of the things, Adrian, you mentioned was this relationship between Terfs and just plain old transphobia, or the relationship between Terfs and the F of Terfs. And one of the things I've sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes have come up against or have seen out there is that if we just took out the TE of Terfs, that all would be good. And I'm not so sure about that actually, because I think for me it's just a wariness of maybe what seems to be this growing, I don't know if I want to call it an obsession, but maybe an obsession with an asterisk there, to validate any and all ideas and feelings that go under the heading of feminism or feminists. Not because it's not that I want to institute one totalizing and proper definition of feminism that we all must measure up to be deemed sufficiently feminist, but more deeply for me, in fact, it's because, so what if you call yourself a feminist, or if a particular action has ties to historical activism that was called feminist? That's actually insufficient to me for determining whether a discourse or action will put in radical work. And I also want to make clear that I'm using work in a way that I hope is outside of various kinds of capitalist discourses. I'm using work in the sense of WERQ that someone like Trevor Ellison talks about in the first chapter of the anthology Trapdoor. So I'm using work in that way. So for me, what we call ourselves is insufficient, though not of no matter. But it's insufficient because my interest, and I think that which will bring about the abolitionist and trans insurrectionist world some of us seek, depends on what your politics look like. And I'm thinking about politics broadly defined. What your politics look like and what kind of work you put in and how you relate to and subvert to and oppose power, as my friends and colleagues Kai M. Green and Kathy Cohen have argued. So feminist work may not, or quote unquote, or maybe not quote unquote, feminist work may not look like the work of feminists past. So it becomes imperative for us, it seems to me, to move and think in between what is legible and deemed natural. It's imperative to think, as the etymology and analytic heft of trans implies, between and across and beyond that which has sedimented as the way things have always been. So the work is my focus now, not to the exclusion of naming practices, because they matter too. But if you're not putting in the work that leads to these kind of abolitionist world-making aims, if you're not mobilizing discourses and bodies and histories, politics, subjectivities, in subversion of hegemonic power or in opposition to the violence of white supremacy and patriarchy and the gender binary of capitalism, then it seems to me that feminism is not really operating in your worldview. So for me, it's less about taking out the bad stuff from Terfism and what is left is going to be good. It's much more about how we create and cultivate and instantiate a mode of living that makes impossible the very logics that Terfism rests upon. That for me is a kind of trans insurrectionist abolitionist mode of living, and that's what I'm interested in.
Thank you. I mean, I think these are all, and it really makes me think. I hope I'm not breaking up again, so I can get through this question. One thing that this comes back to for me is this emphasis on metaphysics. It gets to a point that two wonderful questioners made in the Q&A that I hadn't thought about, which is the absence of religion actually in this kind of discourse.
Well,
right, used to prejudice that's religiously coded. What do we make about this? Is also a story about the absenting of religion in these discourses, or is that more of a red herring? Sorry, did that come through at all?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Were you going to say something, Grace?
No, two things I was going to say, but actually I'm not super sure that it's as remote as you think.
Okay.
Debbie Hayton, who's a prominent kind of anti-trans campaigner, is an evangelical Christian. There's something deeply Catholic about Graham Linehan's aversion to all things trans. And a lot of the language that's being used around gender ideology is either directly or indirectly taken from propaganda campaigns by evangelical churches in the US and by the Catholic Church, which in 2019 put out an encyclical condemning gender ideology entitled Men and Women Who Created Them. In fact, what I would say is that it may very well be the case that this small bubble of gender critical feminists in the middle are not themselves mostly evangelical Christians, although I think some are. But certainly out there on the alt-right fringes, there is a kind of deeply fucked up investment in evangelical critiques of gender ideology.
And there's some good investigative reporting on the transnational network of US and I think mostly US evangelical organizations funneling money, particularly into Latin America, into other religiously organized right-wing organizations that are trying to fund anti-trans legislative initiatives. So I think it's there.
We could think about, for example, the kind of coalition building between supposedly left groups with feminist names. I'm trying to remember the name of this supposedly revolutionary feminist group that partnered with the Heritage Foundation in order to kind of, put together a panel for, I think it was CPAC last year. Wolf, yeah, that's what they were called. In any case, the point that's important is that it's that coalition that is so unique about the turf industrial complex. It isn't that any particular individual perfectly expresses all of this. It's that almost nobody has, up until right now, thought to call out the rampant homophobia, aggression, violence, racism of the alt-right people with whom the gender critical feminists have been getting into bed. So my point is that it's the alliance that's important, and it's the alliance that has been the nature of the political effect. And hopefully, with that alliance beginning to fracture, we might now be able to see some meaningful reforms there.
Right, it becomes the kind of academic discussion that it maybe should have been to begin with, or something like that. There was a commenter in the Q&A who that it seemed two kinds of metaphysical ambiguity being kind of one celebrating it, one side freaking out about it, and what you're saying, I think, is that what makes it the industrial complex is the way it intersects with state power, with media power, with with the medical establishment and that sort of thing. One question, we have about 5 minutes left. One question I really wanted to ask is the role of the child in all this. I know that Jules, you've written so much about this, and I mean, I hate to ask questions like, "Hey, summarize your book for us in 2 minutes." To what extent is the figure of the trans child sort of a central concern here, and to what extent is that really sort of something that we see more in groups that we wouldn't, outside of gender critical feminism, for instance?
Absolutely. I'll do my job and see if I can do my whole book in 2 minutes. No, I think like there's more that lurks under the surface of what might seem clear, right? Children are great targets of politics, right? Children are not even supposed to participate in our version of liberal democracy, however fallacious and idealized it is to begin with, right? Children are not meant to be citizens in the same way that adults are. But the thing that's really sort of remarkable about gender is that gender really hinges on a concept of childhood, on a concept of development, and trans medicine has, like many other fields of medicine, really spent a lot of time trying to understand how it is that we become sexed and we become gendered over the course of a lifetime. So there are reasons that children are central targets that have more to do with just with the fact that children are often targets in political campaigns and children are often reduced to the question of the future. But I really have to say, like, keep your eye on this. I mean, it's here's the rub, right? It's like the children, just before we had this discussion today, a federal appeals court confirmed a ruling in favor of Gavin Grimm, who had been litigating for years for the right to use the boys' restroom. He's long since graduated from high school, right? And that's wonderful. I mean, one question is to think is what happens to your childhood when your childhood is spent litigating whether you can go to the bathroom, right? Like, what kind of childhood is that where there are organized, highly funded, targeted groups of people calling for your eradication from the world? There are stories of trans kids run out of small towns, right? Literally run out of town under threat of violence. But that's actually the smallest slice, and actually, in many ways, the most privileged narrative we have of trans childhood, right? And so almost every trans child out there in the world isn't known in that particular way, has a life that lives outside of those boundaries. But trans children are the condensation point for me of all of this. One is because, really briefly, it's that old truism with a very perverse twist: women and children, right? Women and children, the two forms of people that are the least wanted out of the sort of genres of age and gender that we've created, right? So women and children are often folded in together, right? But children are also the target for genocidal politics, right? So the prevention of trans people's existence would, in theory, be most effective were it to arrest the development of trans children in childhood. The good news is, like, that's not how it really works. And so many of us skipped childhood and then became trans as adults. So we've screwed over the Terfs that way. But yeah, I really think that children hang in the balance. Children both as figures, but also real people's lives. And it's one thing to face harassment as an adult with a PhD. Or to face healthcare discrimination or bullshit walking down the street like I do. I couldn't imagine having had to do that as a child. Like, I doubt I would have fared, I doubt I would be here right now. And so, that's something to think about. Not that it's so disturbing, although it is, that there's a well-funded political movement that seeks the eradication of a whole group of children, right? But that actually, that's the norm, right? That's actually the norm, to manage children that way, right? And there are many kinds of children that don't count as children, and the best example in the United States is not trans children, but Black children who have been completely excluded from the category since its invention. So I think that if you want to sort of track the leading edge of what's going on, keep an eye on not just trans women, but trans women and children, as delightfully 19th century as that sounds.
Well, let me actually take that to maybe get to the final question, which is sort of where do you see the future going? This is something that comes up in the Q&A a lot. The question of what. So Gray seems to think that there might be some kind of productive breaking up of alliances going on. The question of what the future holds it seems to be engaged here, and it seems to be involved here on many levels. And there's of course also this we are thing, right? That in some way what we see here are older feminists kind of freaked out by what younger feminists are getting up to. And that might be one kind of very anodyne reading of what's going on here. So what is the future of this confrontation? I would love to hear from each of you a little bit as sort of a final thought. Marcus, do you want to maybe start?
Yeah, I can start. It's a great question. One I should be better at answering. But I think at least a sliver of my response to this would be that I think perhaps the future. Yeah, I mean, I'm a student very much of Black and trans feminists, and the future is being lived now. And I hope that doesn't sound like a cop out answer, but the future is, as Tina Camp says, of the kind of Black feminist grammar, is that which is being lived now, that which had to have been lived now in order for the future to be possible. And if we are imagining possible future for Black and trans people, or even for subjectivities that have not yet emerged onto the scene because the very conditions do not allow for those subjectivities, even for those subjectivities, I think the future must be lived now. If there is to be some kind of hope, perhaps. But if we're thinking also about the typical understanding of future, I think what that might look like is going to be a very serious, perhaps even a muted, but nevertheless serious reckoning of how we want to exist in the world with one another. How are we going to be? How are we going to be in relation to one another in ways that one can hope will be predicated on non-violent or non-violated ground. And that's going to be very, very difficult, truly, truly difficult, because we're on in battle terrain right now in terms of thinking about what it means to occupy or unoccupy, how we've been scripted or unscripted in terms of gender. So that I think is going to be the terrain on which the future will be, and maybe even is already beginning to be realized. That kind of in battle terrain of how we wish to live in relation to one another.
Jules, you go.
Oh, I don't have much to add to that. I agree. I think the future will be what we're already doing now. That there's not much more that I would want than the glimpses of a life without transphobia that I get with other trans people in community and activism. Like I would just say, if only for the irreverence of it, like the future is T for T, and it's Black and brown, and it doesn't have to be for everyone. It can just be for those of us who are in the know.
I feel a tremendous degree of pride in being trans right now, which is something that I often feel when I read or talk with Marquis and Jules. I think one of the things that is saddest about the Terf industrial complex and the way it monopolizes so much attention in relation to trans people is that it occludes the degree to which, as Marquis says, the future is here and we're living it. And, our lives don't depend on the opinion of, some property British ladies in their 50s who are worried about their daughter's haircut. I am not in the least interested in that, and I'm so grateful for the work that my colleagues and comrades are doing. Since this is the last question, I think one of the things that would be worth just putting on the record before we all go is that during this whole event, the question and answer box has been spammed pretty consistently by Turks and gender critical feminists and trolls. I mean, I say trolls solely because the accounts are anonymous. offering unhelpful and in some cases pretty offensive confrontations of the participants. And I think whatever optimism I have about my community and my activism with trans people, I'm always just struck by the kind of leaden pedantry of what is a lesbian if men can be women, etc. There are so many of these, just these boring one-line questions. Will you comment on Karen White? Well, I think she's a very, very bad person. It's very, very easy to answer these questions. Get real, have a real conversation. And maybe you can see the future too, because it's much more interesting than this fucking nonsense.
Yes, well, thank you all for making this a very incredibly interesting and incredibly energetic hour discussion. And I agree with you that I think that the future is really bright with scholars like you working on this field and with and animating this. And I'm incredibly grateful to have been able to pick all your brains about this. I thought it was absolutely phenomenal, and I hope that many of our attendees today came away also with a kind of hope and the kind of excitement at the spiritedness of these issues. And again, yeah, if you were one of the people in the Q&A who had rehearsed these questions that I'm not a specialist in this field and I'd heard them before, get new material. You might be surprised what you find. Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks to Grace, Marcus, and Jules, and thank you all for being part of this event.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we going on to a separate thread now?
Separate thread now, yes.
Okay. I'm going to stop this recording.
Thank you, Philip.
The recording has stopped.